Thank you. I'm without Jonathan. We're without Jonathan this week, so I got to be very careful about getting all the technology right, which is worrying.
All cross your fingers.
Right. First things first. Rather sad. I had a phone call on Saturday morning to tell you that Cedric Parcell
Oh,
had passed away.
Oh, yes.
He made his 100
Oh,
Yeah,
bless
that's
him.
good.
and had a
Yeah.
lovely party, and was just as naughty, well, almost as naughty as ever. And quietly closed his eyes Saturday morning and gave in to pneumonia.
Oh,
Oh, bless him, yeah.
Good hope. And as I said to Judy on the way over, he'd had enough.
Mm,
yeah.
mm,
But he'd been a good friend to this group.
Certainly had, yes. Oh, yes.
Right, so we'll go on and kick off today, Judy. Welcome back.
Thank you. Yeah. Welcome, everybody.
Hi,
Again,
Judy.
morning,
Judy.
thank you for your loyalty and many thanks for the lovely messages I've received and the cards. I'm very, very much appreciated. All your messages. Thank you very much indeed. You're a lovely group. I keep telling people what a lovely group you are. So the reign of Edward VII,
Yvonne.
the people's budget. It's hard to imagine now how controversial this budget was. A sort of turning point in many ways in our democracy. The thing I didn't mention, which because I was sort of always taking it for granted and thinking, well, everybody knows this. And then when I read my notes through again, I thought, no, of course, why would people all know this? The important factor is that there was a built-in Conservative Unionist majority in the House of Lords. They weren't elected, of course. That was the other issue. House of Lords not elected. So not really very democratic. And they could therefore, because of their inbuilt permanent Conservative Unionist majority, block, if they chose, they could block legislation coming up from the House of Commons if they didn't like the sound of it. But this hadn't happened since the reign of Queen Anne. And I should have explained that, because that's the important issue, really, that they had this power which was undemocratic. They could block the legislation coming up from the House of Commons. So the system is, I'm sure you know, 3 readings in the House of Commons, then legislation goes up to the House of Lords, 3 readings in the House of Lords, then the monarch's signature, and it becomes the law of the land. The statute goes onto the statute book of the law. So this issue was to do with this what became known as the people's budget, the establishment of the welfare state as we know it, the idea of taxing the rich to benefit the poor, a kind of the Robin Hood system, take from those who can afford it to help those who are struggling, the disadvantaged, the people who are struggling with life. And it was the people's budget, part of this great change in attitude. It was a Liberal government pledged to help the disadvantaged, the working classes, in other words. And it just so happened that one of the greatest orators of the age, David Lloyd George, had become the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a new kind of politician, born in poverty, had a tough early life. So all sorts of changes, not only the death of Queen Victoria and the fact that a new king had come to the throne, a new monarch, sorry, had come to the throne, change in all sorts of ways. Social change, the Labour Party was developing, socialist ideas were growing, women were starting to demand their right to vote. There was industrial discontent, far more strikes than had ever been. It was a new age in all sorts of ways. And the famous budget of 1909 seemed to exemplify all these changes. That it was a new reign, a new age. People were looking at ancient institutions in a critical way, instead of saying, oh, we're Britain and we're so proud of our old institutions and they go back to Saxon times and we're the best country in the world. People were beginning to ask questions, and particularly about our strange unwritten constitution. You know, we were selling democracy to the rest of the world, particularly to Europe, you know, have the same setup we've got because we're the best in the world. Look how successful we are with our wonderful system. And people are beginning to say, but it isn't a wonderful system. It isn't. Look at the House of Lords. How ridiculous is that? That they can block legislation which has been voted on and sent up from the House of Commons, which is an elected group of people. The MPs there have been chosen by the people. People in the House of Commons have not. They're there as of right because they own land. People begin to question this. So David Lloyd George, very controversial as an individual, produced some wonderful parliamentary oratory. You know, whether the people at the time agreed with him or not, and an awful lot of people, of course, were absolutely up in arms. They thought he was an absolute outrage, an absolute bounder, for daring to criticize the system, our wonderful establishment of which we were so proud, which sort of established for hundreds of years, daring to criticize the system. And who was he anyway? You know, he was working class himself. How dare he? That was the sort of underlying running through this whole controversy. And fundamental humanitarian principles being debated. Should the extremely rich help the extremely poor to enjoy a better life via taxation? Or, as the Lords argued, many of the Lords, not all, taxation is a form of grand larceny. Taxing land is stealing. So we're talking about principles here, very diametrically opposed principles. So it wasn't just a budget. There are all sorts of other issues involved. And the budget led to a discussion about the role and even the value of the House of Lords. Did we need a two-house system? Could we manage without the House of Lords? Other countries were managing fine with just one chamber. So people begin to ask questions. Why do we need the House of Lords anyway? And if they're going to be obstructive, how are we going to get around this problem? They're just going to go on blocking something they don't like. They don't like this budget. And they're going to go on blocking it. You know, where are we going to go from there? There's going to be some sort of a locking of horns at some stage. And what's the King's role in all this? So the reason for the budget was the need for increased treasury revenue, basically more money. Because, two reasons: the 1908 old age pension legislation, which was hugely controversial, giving people a pension when they were 70 to help them through their old age, so they didn't have to go to the workhouse, basic as that. But even more, the expenditure being demanded by the Admiralty. We were in the very preliminary stages, if you like, of the build up to the First World War. a naval race with Germany. Germany was a new country, and been established as a country, as a united country or empire in 1871. And Germany, particularly under the Kaiser, desperately anxious to catch up with all the other European countries, not only catch up, but overtake in every possible way. They were like the new kids on the block. They were determined to show that they were top nation. And that meant they were going to challenge Great Britain, who for generations has been, probably since the Armada, claimed to be, you know, queen of the sea, the high seas. We were the great naval nation. We got more warships than any other country, etc. So there was this challenge. The Kaiser was busy ordering more and more warships. And so we had to not only keep up, but stay well ahead. Otherwise we'd lose our position in the world. And new ships had been developed called dreadnoughts, absolutely state of the art. I used to know the statistics, but they're a bit boring anyway. But in terms of O-level and A-level, kids had to learn all the statistics of how thick the armor plating was and how many guns and how many, you know, the rate of fire, etc., etc. But we'll pass on that. They were absolutely fantastic ships, but incredibly expensive. And we were, well, the Admiralty was demanding, first of all, they demanded 4. And then they said, just to be on the safe side, we need to build 8. We want 8 and we won't wait. Became a sort of battle cry. Fantastically expensive. The Admiralty, I'm going to say sticking to their guns, but that sounds like a horrible pun. They were saying these great ships were necessary. And it became a popular slogan that we want 8, we won't wait. So the public were behind this. Who was going to pay for them, though? Who was going to pay for these incredibly expensive ships? £2 million each. I mean, people didn't talk in millions in those days. They were still talking in thousands, and certainly not billions like the government talks about today. You know, the word billion trips off their lips. And £2 million. I mean, it was a staggering amount of money for one ship. And the Admiralty wanted 8. The money got to come from somewhere. And Lloyd George and Churchill in the cabinet together were appalled by the escalating cost. And of course, it was up to Lloyd George to work out where the money was going to come from, who was going to pay for the ships and the old age pensions, which is peanuts compared with the cost of these dreadnoughts. So the actual budget itself was a bit of a revolution. Increase, I mean, this is familiar, increased direct taxation on alcohol and tobacco, plus motor car licenses. Interesting. Again, because we were living in a new age, a new form of transport was developing and developing quite rapidly. Cars, not cars as we know them today, but they'd been invented and people were very enthusiastic about them. Rich people were buying a car. So direct taxation, alcohol and tobacco, I think we're familiar with that. Taxing non-necessities. You know, you don't have to drink and you don't have to smoke. So that seemed reasonable. Increase in income tax. To many people, not reasonable. But the really controversial one was a super tax, a new tax called super tax imposed upon the wealthy, a tax on top of income tax, purely because they could afford it, because they were very, very rich. But the really controversial issue was the new duty, 20% on the unearned increment, capital gains would say today, on land value, payable on transfer of the property title. It was a bit complicated, but basically what was being proposed by the Liberal government was that the great landowners would have to submit to having their land valued or measured and valued, all the rents accounted for, etc. And then they would have to pay on the value extra money because of the value of their land. And that created absolute outrage, that the aristocracy were absolutely appalled at the idea, the whole idea just outraged them. Interference in their private concerns. Their land was their land. It was nobody else's business. How dare the government even consider valuing their land and then taxing them on the value of the land. It was regarded as larceny. It was stealing. The Liberal government was going to be stealing from their own people. How outrageous was that? They were going to fight it tooth and nail. And Lloyd George then toured the country using his oratorical skills to explain to people, to explain to the public, and this was a comparatively new idea, talking to ordinary people about this controversial subject and trying to explain to people what the actual situation was. And a bit like today, when somebody comes in, they're interviewed on TV or on the radio, but that was unheard of in those days. Politicians weren't interviewed. They were sacrosanct, they were special. So again, this was a very unusual thing to happen, that Lloyd George, as a man of the people, and he was very proud of saying that, he'd risen from these very difficult beginning origins. A lot of parents being brought up by another family, and he'd had bare feet when he was young. He was poor. He'd been brought up in a little cottage. He was poor. He knew what it felt like. And this was a new thing, that somebody with that kind of background was going around explaining to the ordinary members of the public about a very complicated political situation involving the Constitution. Very flattering to the people he was speaking to. Gladstone had done this, but Gladstone always used such long words that most of the working classes were quite bewildered by what Gladstone was trying to explain. Gladstone, a great liberal, also believed in if we really got a democracy, ordinary people ought to be involved in political decisions. They ought to know what the issues were. We'd say today, we'd use that word, issues. So this is all very new and very controversial. So Lloyd George went around the country. The king, poor King Edward, was furious about this. He'd been very understanding about the actual budget. He did understand about the plight of the poor, rather confusingly, because people thought that, imagine that he wouldn't have a clue. He'd be on the side of the lords. He'd be on the side of the aristocrats, the people he mixed with, his friends were aristocrats. But what they hadn't realised, and I didn't put it in my notes, was that he was far more cosmopolitan than people realised. That King Edward, yes, most of his friends were aristocrats, but he had many friends who weren't, including a lot of people who were what we now called self-made men, many of them Jewish. And he was criticised for having these Jewish friends. They were landowners, but they'd bought the land. They hadn't inherited it. They hadn't had the land since the Norman conquest. And he was much more cosmopolitan than people had realised. He was, I mean, one thing that, again, I didn't put in the notes, he was very, very sociable, despite his strange upbringing. Thought he would have ended up being really shy, but he wasn't. He was outgoing. He didn't really discriminate when he met people. He just liked meeting people. But when he invited people to Sandringham, and so he was very sociable, very hospitable, he met them. He didn't expect a butler or a servant to meet them. He came to the door and greeted them, and he took them to their room, because they were house guests. They were going to stay for a while. He took them to their room, and if it was cold weather. There was a fire in their room, and he actually got the poker and poked the fire and made it blaze up. Which, when I read about that years ago, I thought, what a lovely thing to do, to make people feel really welcome. What a lovely gesture. And nobody taught him to do that. It was something that just came naturally to him, to make people feel welcome in his home. And he continued to behave like that. So people always felt really comfortable in Sandringham and happy to be there and truly welcome. He was a wonderful host. And therefore, he did have an understanding, which took some people by surprise. He did understand what the issues were here and wasn't opposed to the idea of helping the poor. But he did feel he was being dragged into something more controversial than he'd bargained for. He didn't approve of his Chancellor of the Exchequer going around the country sort of making people agitated. He felt that Lloyd George was a bit out of control and needed reining in by the Prime Minister. You know, he kept appealing to Asquith, you know, do something. Don't let him loose like this. Who knows what he's going to say? So the king was sort of almost like facing in two directions. Understood the point of this budget, helping the poor. Yes, he approved of that very much, but he didn't approve of what he described as rabble rousing, because he felt that the country was on a bit of a knife edge. There was a lot of industrial discontent, as already said, a lot of strikes, lockouts. There was the country was quite restless, and so Lloyd George was encouraging class war and discontent. But Lloyd George just carried on regardless. He was on a mission. So I want to read some of the actual speeches that he made. Martin's found some lovely pictures of the actual, well, certainly the most controversial of the speeches he made, which was the Limehouse, the great Limehouse speech that he made in London in well, it was a sort of pub and music hall, which again the king disapproved of. You know, why did he go to a place like that? Well, he gone to a place like that because that's where the working class people went, and they were the people that he was speaking to. So I'm reading directly from Lloyd George's speech. A few months ago, a meeting was held not far from this hall in the heart of the City of London, demanding that the government should launch out and run into enormous expenditure on the Navy. That meeting ended up with a resolution promising that those who passed the resolution would give financial support to the government in their undertaking. There have been 2 or 3 meetings held in the City of London since, attended by the same class of people, but not ending up with a resolution promising to pay. On the contrary, we are spending the money, but they don't pay. What has happened since to alter their tone? Simply that we have sent in the bill. We started our 4 dreadnoughts. They cost 8 millions of money. We promised them 4 more. They cost another 8 millions. Somebody has got to pay. And these gentlemen say, perfectly true, somebody has got to pay, but we would rather that somebody were somebody else. We started building, we wanted money to pay for the building, so we sent the hat round. We sent it round amongst the workmen and the miners of Derbyshire and Yorkshire, the weavers of Dumfries, who, like all their countrymen, know the value of money. They all brought in their coppers. We went round Belgravia. But there has been such a howl ever since that it has completely deafened us. So you can see he's got a rather sarcastic, satirical way of speaking, which would grab people's attention. But they say, it doesn't say who he means, but people have worked out, the aristocracy, it is not so much the dreadnoughts we object to, it's the pensions. If they object to pensions, why did they promise them? They won elections on the strength of their promises. It's true they never carried them out. Deception is always a pretty contemptible vice, but to deceive the poor is the meanest of all crimes. And so on and so on. The budget is introduced not merely for the purpose of raising barren taxes, but taxes that are fertile taxes, taxes that will bring forth fruit, the security of the country, which is paramount in the midst of all. The provision for the aged and deserving poor. It was time it was done. It is rather a shame for a rich country like ours, probably the richest country in the world, if not the richest the world has ever seen, that it should allow those who have toiled all their days to end in penury and possibly starvation. It is rather hard that an old workman should have to find his way to the gates of the tomb, bleeding and footsore through the brambles and thorns of poverty. We cut a new path through it, an easier one, a pleasanter one through fields of waving corn. We are raising money to pay for the new road, aye, and to widen it, so that 200,000 paupers shall be able to join in the march. There are many in the country blessed by Providence with great wealth, and if there are amongst them men who grudge out of their riches a fair contribution towards the less fortunate of their fellow countrymen, they are shabby rich men. We propose to do more by means of the budget. We are raising money to provide against the evils and the sufferings that follow from unemployment. We are raising money for the purpose of assisting our great friendly societies to provide for the sick and the widows and orphans. We are providing money to enable us to develop the resources of our own land. I do not believe that any fair-minded man would challenge the justice and the fairness of the objects which we have in view in raising this money. Then he talks about his visit to a coal mine. And he launches into a very sarcastic diatribe against people who can't understand the lives of others and the sufferings of others. The other day, at the great Tory meeting held in the Cannon Street Hotel, they had blazoned on the walls, "We protest against the budget in the name of democracy, liberty and justice." Where does the democracy come in this land and system? Where is the justice in all these transactions? We claim that the tax we impose on land is fair, just and moderate. They go on threatening that if we proceed, they will cut down their benefactions and discharge labour. What kind of labour? What is the labour they're going to choose for dismissal? Are they going to threaten to devastate rural England while feeding themselves and dressing themselves? Are they going to reduce their gamekeepers? That would be sad. The agricultural labourer and the farmer might then have some part of the game, which they fatten with their labour, and so on. He's very sarcastic about how the Lords have reacted to this suggestion of taxing their land. And he ends by saying, "We are placing the burdens on the broad shoulders." Why should I put burdens on the people? I am one of the children of the people. I was brought up amongst them. I know their trials, and God forbid that I should add one grain of trouble to the anxiety which they bear with such patience and fortitude. When the Prime Minister did me the honour of inviting me to take charge of the National Exchequer at a time of great difficulty, I made up my mind, in framing the budget which was in front of me, that at any rate, no cupboard should be bared, no lot would be harder to bear. By that test, I challenge them to judge the budget. And the king was appalled at this speech, absolutely horrified. Because to him, it was encouraging the working classes to turn against their lords and masters, being a sort of peasants' revolt as far as the king was concerned. He found this just absolutely dreadful.
What a lovely turn of phrase he's got, Judy. Very easy,
yeah,
to understand,
that was
to take in, wasn't it?
The beauty of the way he spoke was that he was speaking to ordinary people who hadn't had a great education. And he wasn't patronising them because he was a man of the people, as he kept saying. And the king, well, as Asquith pointed out, Asquith was the prime minister, and Asquith was very reasonable in speaking to the king, trying to calm the king down. And the king had a bad temper. He inherited that from his mother, not his father. The king could be very irascible, and he was very upset about all this. But as Asquith pointed out to Lloyd George, I urge you to apologise to him, because the king, of course, lives in an atmosphere which is full of hostility to us, meaning the Liberal Party, and to our proposals, but he is not himself unfriendly. And so far, he has stood the budget very well. It's a funny phrase, stood it well, means he hasn't gone absolutely, he isn't totally opposed to it. He understands the point of it, but he doesn't really want his ministers running around the country making inflammatory speeches. It is important, therefore, to avoid raising his apprehensions and alienating his goodwill. And so Lloyd George accepted the argument. He'd met the king on several occasions. He liked him. He got on with him. He found him very reasonable, surprisingly reasonable. And so Lloyd George wrote the letter, and it was graciously accepted by the king. So thank goodness Asquith was a calm sort of person, and he'd risen to the occasion and managed to sort of pour oil on troubled waters, really. He managed to calm both of them down. Interestingly, the king turned his rage on Winston Churchill. He couldn't stand Winston Churchill, but then a lot of people couldn't. A lot of people couldn't stand Winston Churchill. Partly because he'd started off life as a Conservative. His father had been a politician. In fact, his father had been Chancellor of the Exchequer for a short time. And then Winston Churchill had fallen out with the Conservative Unionist Party and had become a Liberal. He was then in the Liberal government as President of the Board of Trade. Often seen with Lloyd George, he looked up to Lloyd George. He found Lloyd George fascinating, especially the oratory. But the king absolutely detested him, as many people did, because they didn't trust him. You know, he changed sides because he was ambitious, and they didn't like his style. They found him very arrogant and self-serving, and they didn't much like his sense of humour. They hated him. And the king particularly disliked him intensely, and actually made a joke about him being called Winston Churchill, WC, and actually said that his initials were so well named, WC, water closet. And in a way, that showed the king as being quite astute. He was quite good at analysing people's characters. He was good at that. Because at the time, Winston, and for many, many years, Winston Churchill was not trusted. People didn't like his personality. And then, of course, he said once something about it takes courage to rat once, but it takes even more courage to re-rat, because he then went back to abandoned the Liberals, went back to the Conservative Party, which meant that even more people hated him and distrusted him. Well, Lloyd George, although he'd apologised to the king, he'd absolutely no intention of changing his ways, and he continued to promote the budget and the issues. He made inflammatory speeches at Newcastle, famously ridiculing the peerage as 500 men, ordinary men, accidentally chosen. Sorry, I'm saying this wrong. 500 men, ordinary men, chosen accidentally from among the unemployed, which is a lovely mocking way of saying aristocrats didn't have a job. They'd inherited their wealth, they'd inherited their land, they'd inherited several stately homes. Some of them had up to 5 stately homes. They had a pad in London. Belgravia was mentioned, where they had their London home. He was really trying to provoke them by this time. He really was looking forward to a showdown. he wanted this issue, the power of the aristocracy to be broken, the power of the House of Lords to block legislation, democratic legislation. He did want a confrontation of some kind. Liberals and the Labour Party were hoping that this would take place because they wanted to limit the power of the House of Lords forever. So the House of Lords could never block legislation which had been debated and discussed and voted on and which had come up from the House of Commons to be ratified really by the House of Lords. What was going to happen if they just went on blocking Liberal legislation? The King acted as peacemaker, urging both political parties to do what was right for the country, not just whatever served narrow party interests. Again, the King could see the wider picture. So the crisis timetable was November, end of November, the Lords reject the budget. The government threatened to punish the Lords by reducing their power. The country divided. The Liberals lost their huge majority. They lost their popularity by this time. Conservative Unionists had 47% support, outnumbered by Liberals plus their allies. The allies were the Little Labour Party and the Irish Nationalist Party. This led to a general election to try and sort the problem out. So January 1910, general election. An absolutely hung parliament, absolute balance of power. Very, very unusual, hardly ever happens. Absolute balance. Irish National Party decided that they held the power, and they used their advantage to demand home rule. This thing had been running on right through Gladstone's time. The Irish did not want to belong to the British Empire anymore. They wanted to be independent and free. So, having got this amazing bargaining advantage that they held the balance of power, they said, we will vote with you, Liberal lot, if you do something for us. We would like to be independent. Another controversy. 29th of April, budget accepted by the House of Lords, but profound problems still not settled. Another election in 1910. It's the only time there have been two elections in 1 year. So, general election in January, general election in December. Exactly the same thing happened, slightly different numbers, but another hung parliament. And in the middle of all this, King Edward died. Not because of it, but what a time for the monarch to die. Or what a not so bad for him, because he was out of it all, but for his son, George V, our present Queen's grandfather, poor George V, coming to the throne in the middle of a huge controversy about the power of the House of Lords. Should it be dealt with? The question, of course, was, how could you deal with it? Well, you could deal with it by legislation. How could you get the Lords to vote for legislation which reduced their power? It'd be like turkeys voting for Christmas. The only ways around that was for the King to create lots of new peers and make sure they were all Liberal. So back to the reign of William IV and the great debate over the Reform Act of 1832. That's exactly what William IV was asked to do. Create enough peers to drown, to sort of flood the House of Lords with Liberals, so that the built-in majority just disappeared. Artificially changed the constitution. So poor George V, who wasn't the brightest button in the box, it has to be said, inherited this awful political situation with the country up in arms by this time because of Lloyd George having gone around preaching the word about the budget and about the House of Lords and mocking the aristocrats and saying how mean and selfish and self-centered they all were. George V inherited a very difficult situation. So we'll switch from that to the last period of Edward VII's life. Very poor health, which he brought on himself. He, well, the first thing that happened, it wasn't his fault. He had to postpone the coronation due to a massive abdominal abscess. Most books say it was appendicitis, but when they opened him up, the surgeon found this absolutely awful abscess, and when he dealt with it, the king nearly died. If it hadn't been for the courage and skill and determination of the royal surgeon, Sir Frederick Trave, the king would have died. It was all handled very, very well, but the king's life really was in danger. And again, people didn't really understand how brave the king had been. He'd been in agony for days and totally resisting medical intervention, trying to kill it with alcohol, trying to make the pain go away with just drinking, and just saying, I can't let my people down. I have got to be crowned king. I mean, they're looking forward, everything ready. Everything was ready for the coronation. You know, all the memorabilia was ready. You know, the plates and mugs and cups and things, you know, with the date on. King very conscious about this, which is great. I mean, he wasn't thinking about himself and his pain. He was actually forcing himself, or trying to force himself to get well so that he could attend. He said, I will go, even if I have to go crawl up the aisle on my hands and knees. Hey, what courage, because he was in terrible pain. And then he collapsed, and then, you know, the whole thing was taken out of his hands and he had to be operated on. And so the coronation was postponed. He was a very, very heavy smoker. Nowadays we'd call him a chain smoker. And he smoked the most enormous cigars. People are absolutely amazed when they saw these cigars. They've never seen such big cigars in all their lives. He had special ones sent to him from Cuba, you know, Havana cigars. And he didn't say light one from the one he'd finished, but there was always a cigar waiting for him, and he smoked very, very heavily. And of course, he got bronchitis as a result of this. Whether he recognised this or not, we don't know, but he just defiantly ignored medical advice, give up smoking, no way. In fact, he smoked more and more. The more he coughed and the more episodes of really bad bronchitis he had, the more he smoked. So whether it was just defiance or whether it was something he just desperately needed. But his poor doctors were in despair, because he did have some terrible bouts where he coughed so much he passed out. Often it was with the mistress, one of his women, and they panicked. You know, what are we going to do? The king's dying. This is going to be very embarrassing if the press get hold of it. But he wouldn't give up the smoking.
Or the women.
Or the women. Or the women. He was also very overweight. He fluctuated. He went every year for what was called the cure. He went to various continental spa towns, mainly in Germany and Austria. And they worked very well. They worked wonders. He came back looking quite trim and well, and then started eating again. Absolutely enormous meals, which beg a belief when you read the menu, how many courses there were, up to 9 courses. And he was wolfing down food all the way through, you know, eating every and the dessert, not at any point saying, no, thank you, I've had a plentiful sufficiency. I'm overfaced, like we say in Yorkshire. He never seemed to get overfaced. He just went on eating. So very, very overweight.
Yes. You don't want any more.
On the other hand,
A little bit at a time.
a life of self-indulgence.
Yeah, foods and
But on the other hand, it made him popular.
it's addictive, isn't it? It is. Yes, yes.
Strangely,
Yes.
it made him popular. They loved it. They called him good old Teddy. The people read that, well, they didn't read the court circular. They found out from the newspapers though where the king was, what he was doing, if he was going to the races or going to the theatre. There were always, especially in London, crowds of people just waiting, often in the rain, to see him, just to see him. and cheer him. Good old Teddy. You can imagine anyone shouting out "good old Vicky" to Queen Victoria. He was on his dignity on special occasions. You know, we were proud to see him in his robes and in his you know, but he was a man of the people. Many people surprised because of the way he'd been brought up. He was a man of the people. He understood people. He smiled, he greeted them, and they responded by loving him. And the more they knew about his private life, the more they seemed to love him. It didn't seem to make any difference that he'd got this string of mistresses, partly because he was, again, pretty cosmopolitan. He had working class mistresses, he had dancers, he had ladies from the Folies Bergère when he went to Paris. That made the people love him more. But he had posh aristocratic mistresses, and he had almost not exactly kitchen maids, but he was a wide range. People thought it was great. They'd thrown away the sort of Victorian prudishness, and he represented the new age of freedom. They loved the fact that he went to races and that he liked eating, smoking, shooting, gambling, women, the theatre, not highbrow. He wasn't particularly interested in Shakespeare. He was almost like he enjoyed music hall. He enjoyed going to the Folies Bergère in Paris. And that's why people loved him. He had an enjoyment of life. They weren't condemning him. They weren't sitting on the moral high ground saying, "Oh, isn't it dreadful? We've got a king to be so ashamed of." Far from it. He loved horse racing. He had pet dogs. He loved motoring. He was one of the first people to buy a car. Absolutely loved it. So he was a very, very popular monarch. He spent very little time with poor Queen Alexandra. Luckily for him, she was very patient, very understanding, and she didn't make scenes or throw things or have rows with him. She was there on state occasions looking absolutely wonderful, totally elegant, absolutely fantastic figure, never seemed to age, wore her jewels with great aplomb. She just looked absolutely marvelous. Every photograph you see of her, she just looked absolutely amazing and ageless. She just never seemed to get any older. And totally accepted his mistresses in a just a philosophical sort of way. You know, what can you do? That's the way my husband is. And was very generous towards the last mistress, who may not have been a mistress in the true sense. Great grandmother of Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, Alice Keppel, his constant companion in his last months, when his health really was very dodgy. He was having repeated bronchial attacks and indigestion, all sorts of things, because of his lifestyle. And he did eventually die, to us quite young, 68, died of bronchitis and heart failure, constantly on oxygen. In fact, unbeknown to the public, he was having a lot of supplementary oxygen when he was sitting working at his desk. He was on oxygen. Obviously, that was kept out of the public, didn't know about that. The press weren't told anything about that. The press in those days were much more respected. They respected royalty. They didn't. They were deferential. Absolutely, not like now. No. People only knew what they were allowed to know, and it was left to the king to decide how much they should know. So one wonderful example, really, of how popular he was with his people, with our ancestors, how much they really genuinely loved him, was he was the first king to lie in state. I found that very surprising. I thought it was a tradition that went way back, but apparently not. It was decided that his body would lie in state, so that people could pay, ordinary people, the Londoners in particular, could pay their last respects. But surprisingly, it wasn't just Londoners. People actually paid out of their small earnings. Working class people actually paid to travel to London. And at one point, the queue was 4 miles long, 6 abreast in pouring rain. And many people in those days didn't have Macs or waterproofs. And they stood perfectly respectably. The police were horrified, thought there were going to be riots and all sorts of terrible things would happen because of all these people crowding into London. But no, they just stood and waited and shuffled forward, crying, terribly upset. 8 kings and 1 emperor rode behind the king's coffin on the day of his funeral, plus his little dog Caesar. And people, when they saw the little dog, a lot of people broke down because that was just a human touch. His favourite little dog. He had been a good king. He'd done a lot for foreign policy, a lot for foreign relationships through the fact that he actually was related to many of the European royalty. He was the uncle of Europe, he was called. But he'd also made them feel proud to be British, and that's why so many people were sorrowful when he died. They felt they had lost a good king, and that was his legacy. He proved, despite his strange childhood and the fact that everybody thought he was a loser and a lightweight, and that he was going to be a disastrous king, turned out to be very successful indeed and left a very important legacy. So next time we'll do how the House of Lords were finally controlled, as they are today, and the lead up to the First World War. Thank you very much for listening.
Sorry, we've lost the picture for that last little bit. We'll gather again in a fortnight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.